Okay, so I put together a description of a case study, which I'm hoping will have a few elements that will be useful to talk about. But I also recognize that you all and fellows and faculty bring so much experience into the room that, there's nothing I could say that you probably don't already know. So I hope this is just an opportunity for dialogue about different issues. So I'll go through a few, a couple of points and then really open it up for discussion. Here's my disclaimer, I work for the government, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just, there's this little phrase we use in the Army. I'm not part of the Army, but I do work with the Army. So bottom line up front is every memo starts with the bottom line up front, which is actually, it's a kind of an interesting approach. So I'm just putting out a few of my sort of pet ideas here, and again, I really look forward to the discussion. We emphasize informed consent a lot in research ethics, and I'm just pointing out here there's limitations on what work consent can do for us. It doesn't ensure that the study has a reasonable risk and benefit ratio if you get consent for participation. It doesn't address group harms, which you already know. It doesn't substitute for stakeholder engagement or bi-directional dialogue. So some of the issues that you all have already brought up about how do we know what people are thinking and how do we know how they're perceiving a trial or a research study or what their concerns are. Consent doesn't help us do that because it's a one-way process. We tell you about the study, we don't know what you think about the study or about the larger research program. And it may not promote trust. We've all experienced, 25-page consent forms. I don't know a single person who's encountered these kind of long legalistic consent forms that says this is not participant friendly and this is not helping us with good communication, and yet we continue to have them. And as I'm an IRB chair, we have 25-page consent forms all the time in our research, and I can't seem to do anything about that. So why am I going on about informed consent? Well, because we have sort of our basic research ethics principles that we come back to about, autonomy and respect for persons, and the sort of main procedural parts of research ethics are IRB review and informed consent. Those are the procedures that we're taught and reinforced that we need to pay a lot of attention to. And yes, those are really good and important, but there's so much out here that's not encapsulated in those procedures. So let's go to the next slide.
We need a bluff for all the consent.
Yes, the bottom line up front. Yes, exactly. Okay, so then some of the other issues that I'm hoping we'll talk about voluntariness, especially because of Brendan's work with the police and what is it like to be in a hierarchical organization and making sure people can sign up voluntarily for research. We have that issue in the military, of course. Confidentiality, everybody's worried about confidentiality, as they should be. And to my way of thinking, I think a lot of our issues about confidentiality are that we make commitments as researchers to protect confidentiality, but people don't always believe that we're going to do that. And it's a huge issue about trust. And what do we do about that? Because, the IRB is going to look at your protocol and look at your plan and your anonymization or your security plan and everything. We're doing all that due diligence. But people in the world don't feel safe when it comes to confidentiality. And so that's an issue. Again, I don't know if our research ethics procedures are helping to solve this problem of people not having faith that we're going to keep the data confidential. Next slide. And then group harms, again, you all are more familiar than I am with all of the sensitive issues around groups, and so I hope to just engage in some discussion about how we can think about group harms, which, as we mentioned earlier, we all recognize that it's not addressed in our federal regulations. It's not part of the mandate of IRBs explicitly to look at group harms. It's, the IRB process is very individualistic, and that's not actually how a lot of these issues work, especially when we're in situations involving vulnerable populations. Okay, so let me talk about, so that's just kind of my quick snapshot of everything I think about these topics. Let's go on to this case study. In our research center, we have a group that does behavioral health research and military psychiatry that works on suicide prevention. So they did this study called Behavioral Health Readiness and Suicide Risk Reduction Review called R4. And one of the interesting things about research in the military is that sometimes it's directed by like the Secretary of the Army or the Deputy Undersecretary of the Army that says, you shall do this program. So they directed, they issued this directive that there should be a new suicide prevention tool that could be used by leaders in military units to help identify people at risk for suicide and make sure that they get appropriate behavioral health care and follow-up. And one reason they had made this directive in 2017 is there was a previous tool that was made in 2012 that nobody liked. None of the actual military leaders liked the tool. It wasn't deemed to be very effective. They said, we need a new one. We got to have a new one. So this group at our institute, at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, was tasked with developing the tool and evaluating the tool. And in developing the tool, they really spent a lot of time getting Army leader feedback and input on what kind of tool did they need, what kind of tool would work, what was wrong with the old tool, what should the new one look like. And they also, of course, reviewed the evidence, scientific evidence on suicide prevention, what are the predictors of suicide, and what are the type of risk factors that they should be looking for in their population in order to intervene at some step in order to reduce suicidal attempts, etc. Okay, next slide, please. I'm not going to try to read through all this stuff, but if you look at the left-hand side of the screen here, they report 76 qualitative feedback sessions with 220 Army leaders. Those all different levels of leaders. And then the literature search was very robust. And they included information from the literature review in terms of what predictors they put into the tool itself, what things people should look for. They interviewed some expert military psychiatrists who worked on actual suicide cases, and they excluded any criteria relating to suicide risk that couldn't be assessed readily in that context, because it's all like genetic risk, for example. It's all supposed to be very practical. What can you do in the real world? Next slide. Just to let you know, it's hard to see this. This is the military, the different units in the Army, and the level at which this intervention was delivered was the platoon level, platoon and lower level, these are the sort of lower level leaders, and the company level, company commander and first sergeant, who are the leaders at the company level. They developed two different tools, one for the commander company level and one for the platoon level. They had slightly different responsibilities, but basically the point was that at both of these leader levels, the idea is to have a tool that helps people to assess risk among the soldiers under their watch and connect with those soldiers at risk. In the platoon case, they would be advised to connect with a face-to-face conversation and follow up and see what's going on and see what kind of assistance this person needs, and also to communicate it to the commander level. And the program also set up regular meetings. There would be monthly meetings between the platoon leaders and the company leaders for the purpose of risk assessment, which wasn't currently happening. Next slide. This is too small to see, but this is a screenshot of the tool itself. It's a one-page thing. It's meant to be practical. It asks a series of questions, and there's answers, and then what did you do? What was your follow-up? You fill up these blanks. Next slide. This is just the second half. It's an 8.5 by 11 sheet. So they had one version for the platoon leaders and one version for the company commanders. Next slide. So the other thing, so they were directed to develop the tool and then evaluate the tool. Oops, go back. Oh, sorry, no. Okay. Yeah, that's where we are. Okay, so they have, I'll describe the evaluation strategy. So so one of the questions that came up when they were developing this study was, is this a research study or a program evaluation study? And then, you know,
Yeah. For every question.
whoever decide, and there's no guidelines and none of it makes any sense. We could talk for a long time about that, but this came to me. I was new in my job and I was an IRB chair, and they gave me this protocol and said, okay, you decide, is this research or program evaluation? I, in the end, said it's research, but in my heart wanted to say program evaluation because I thought it should just go forward like program evaluation because that's what it is. But we could talk about that, but I'll just to get through this description. Because it was, we called it research, then they had to make participation voluntary. Now, the military is mandating that all the leaders get the tool and that all the leaders should be instructed to use the tool and that all the people should take the survey, because the military can do that. It's called an op order, an operational order. They can just say, you're going to do this. But once you say something's research, they can't mandate that you participate in research. So once we said it was research, they had to say the use of the survey data to evaluate this tool, you can opt out of having your data used. Now, everybody sat in the room and did the survey, but they get to check a box, yes or no, do you want the data to be used or not used? And by the way, the survey was completely anonymous. There's no identifiers on it anywhere. So that's just an interesting question. All right, so there were 2 divisions included in this evaluation, 4 brigades in each division. And there was the intervention consisted of introduction to the R4 tools and instructions and orientation for the leaders. The control group or comparison group was business as usual, which was the previous whatever they did about suicide prevention. They had a previous tool that nobody liked. They weren't required to use it anymore, but they were familiar with the idea that they're supposed to be following up people at risk and referring people for behavioral health. That was already a familiar concept to the leaders. It wasn't that there was nothing.
Were the controls within the divisions or against other divisions?
I think the 2 divisions were just, one was R4 and one was business as usual. So it wasn't randomized because it was too hard to randomize, right? You have these huge units with structure, you know, but they tried to make them comparable in a sense. So it was they called it quasi-randomized, right. So it wasn't really a randomized trial, but it was a comparative trial.
Right.
So, okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is part, again, with the evaluation. Phase 1, they did a baseline survey of soldiers and leaders asking about health status behaviors, including, you know, things like suicidal thinking, ideation, and attempts, and et cetera, all of the behaviors of interest, but also your basic demographics and other stuff. So this was baseline. And then there were additional questions for the leaders about tool-related, you know, interactions. And then for the intervention group only, they did the orientation to the tool. And then for follow-up, for both intervention and control groups, they had 2 time points, 6 months and 1 year, but they followed up again with this survey about health status, behaviors, et cetera, et cetera. In order to link surveys from different time points, they would have people generate their own code. So you would be asked something like, you know, what's your favorite color and the model of your first car, or, you know, you had something that you would write down that you could remember that no one else would be able to put together about you. And that's how, so there was absolutely no identifiers on any part of these surveys. And then consent for use of data. And then in each packet, because these are anonymized, you know, anonymous surveys, and suppose somebody did have risk for suicide and they report that, there's no way for researchers to reach them and figure out who they are. Right. So there was a behavioral health resource sheet with contacts, local contacts for their behavioral health people in each packet. Was there any questions so far? Okay, next slide.
I did have a question. So I know when you're talking about the distinction between program eval and the So do you mean after the development of the survey? Because I was thinking early on, like developing the survey, obviously like the approach clearly was research versus, I guess I was thinking, what would the program be? Are you just saying that
Well, yeah, so if you the development of the tool.
yeah, the tool itself, that developing that.
Well, so if you call the tool, if you call R4 a program, because, I mean, it is a program, right? But a program could be a new program that you're setting up via a research study, or it could just be a program. I guess, so here's one way that I think about these things. Suppose the military had just decided we want to have this new suicide prevention program, and we're not going to evaluate it.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going to take this piece of paper and we're going to implement this across all of our divisions. Now, no one would really call that research.
Right.
But the risk to people is the same of having this piece of paper and these leaders and these instructions and these things, the risks or the benefits. It's the same as if you do that and then you evaluate it.
Right.
Right? So it's the evaluation that makes people say, well, it's probably research. But my difficulty with this on a conceptual level is that the research didn't create risk. The program may or may not have created risk, but you just have complete license to implement a program with no oversight whatsoever if you don't do any evaluation of it. And that to me seems kind of backwards.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't want, and I'd love to talk about this more because I got way into a big rabbit hole with this, but is that good enough for the
Yeah,
moment?
I guess, I was thinking more like if there was a program that was already in existence and you evaluated it, then maybe like, you could, but because it was basically being
New.
developed, then.
Yeah, and that's why,
Yeah.
and that's why
Yeah.
I went in with my IRB chair hat on, I
Right.
called it research, reluctantly.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think even if you go in and evaluate, like I've been on studies that necessarily, because it's inexistent. Yeah.
Brandon, did you?
No, I'm in, the last hurdle hopefully for some NIH funding is the IRB that I'm waiting to get approved to evaluate the decriminalization of non-prescribed buprenorphine in Rhode Island. And that's already happening. It's already run its course for a year, and we want to talk to people about the effects, right? And the IRB, the debate now is should it be informed consent or waiver of written consent, because the research itself is creating the risk in its entirety is what the
But
IRB
waiver
is.
of written consent is consent. It's just they don't have to sign
No, right. So that's and clearly so we reorganized the IRB. We reorganized the study to make it completely anonymous with the waiver of written consent rather than informed, than signed consent, because the argument was that it's an evaluation and the research itself is the only risk. And the risk is anonymity, it's confidentiality.
Right.
it. Yeah.
Well, so, I mean, and this
Right.
is I think there's a lot of times where once you get into the research lane, you can get into, a regulatory situation that's just not helpful for advancing what you're trying to do. And, but, so, there's more to talk about. Well, I'll try to get to the end of this description and then we'll open it up to different issues. Okay, so they, just back, sorry, to where we were. Okay, so about the survey included consent for use of data and research. About 60 to 80% of the people consented to use of the data and research, and the others didn't, which is interesting. Because the Army already had their data. They already filled out the survey. And it was anonymous. But so 20 to 40% of them said, well, you have my data, but I don't want you to use it, which is just an interesting question. Okay, next slide. Okay, so there wasn't a lot of power to detect actual suicides because although they're a serious problem, they're statistically relatively rare, as you all know, and since you're all psychologists, So they had some level of power to detect reduction in attempts and ideation. And then, so that's just, you know, the pragmatic fact that it's very hard to do studies that quantitatively get it to the actual risk of suicides. And then in terms of voluntariness, the soldiers were segregated from leaders during survey administration. This is sort of standard practice. It's also consistent with DoD regulations that you can't have supervisors and leaders in the same room, you know, in terms of recruiting or enrolling people in studies. You have to make sure they're separate. People feel free to not fill out the survey if they don't want to, etc. I mentioned there was a control group. Oh, I already mentioned this about the consent issue. Next slide, please. The results were, just quickly, that both groups had a decrease in the suicidal behaviors that were captured, which is ideations, plans, and attempts. Both groups, the control and the R4 group, had a decrease that was statistically significant from their own baseline, but the two groups didn't have a statistically significant difference between them. So the conclusion from this first paper of preliminary results is there's no evidence of harmful effect of R4 intervention, but you can't say that you also can't say it's effective. And then to get an actual, you know, effectiveness of actual suicide prevention, you need a larger sample.
Absolutely.
Right, so this is a question, you know, it's a,
Can't do it,
yeah, this is, well, you know, this is the military, they have pretty large numbers. But,
That's true.
you know,
That's
so
true.
this was about 6,000 people or so.
Right,
They do very, very large studies. They do studies with like 30,000 people
Right.
with surveys.
well,
And so you could do a larger study. I think they're probably planning to do a larger study that would actually look at whether there's reduction in suicides. So, you know, because one of the questions I asked myself when I looked at this study is, well, if this is a pilot study, is it a good idea to do a pilot study with so many people? But trying to get the power to assess any kind of change here, you need thousands of people. So it's kind of, that's the kind of just the arithmetic involved. Next slide. Okay, so I asked whether it was research or program evaluation. Why did some people decline to have their data used for research? This, to me, kind of gets at the issue of trust. You know what? There are people, and now, understandably, right? Well, I don't want you using my data. You know, in point of fact, the same people who can use the data for research already had the data. They just can't use it because that's the rule. You know, it has to be voluntary. But there isn't actually any. First of all, it's anonymous. Second of all, they already have the data because you already did the survey. So to me, this kind of speaks to the question of what are we really trying to get at with voluntariness, and what are we really trying to get at with our promises of confidentiality if some big percentage of people don't believe that we're actually going to keep things confidential, or that it actually is anonymous.
And how different that would have been if you called it a program evaluation rather than research.
Then everybody would have just turned in the data, and that would be that.
they would have to, but also, I mean, the problem is that you don't know if these 20 or 30% were more likely, you know, would have responded differently. That's why they don't want them. Are they more at risk?
Right, you don't know that.
Right.
True. No, they did actually describe the demographics of the people. They compared the demographics of the people.
But they know
yes.
to the risk factor?
No, not the risk
That,
factors.
well, that's the
but they
issue
have-
here, right?
Yeah, the risk factors, you can't get
Right.
that, but you could get the demographics, and the demographics were similar. But because you can get the demographics of the whole division.
Yeah, but they don't get, it's probably not if they're a man or a woman or what their race is, it's whether or not they feel they were at risk, and then they're going to be a problem if somebody identifies them in that way, right? They probably have to go through a lot of stuff and could risk some of their positions, right? If you're identified as suicidal in the military, I assume things happen.
Things happen, yeah. So, yeah, and people with serious mental health issues in the military often have to leave
Right.
service. So there is, it's exactly that kind of problem. And
So it could actually have been higher, the rate, you don't really know.
Oh.
Or it also implies that this 20-30% is not letting their leaders know how they're feeling.
it could be
potentially.
that could be also the case. Yeah, you don't know. You really don't know, because you don't know why they checked that box. You know, so, so we recently had a question, so we have a research ethics consultation service, right? There's two of us, it's a very small service, but, but we had a question recently, it was kind of interesting, it was a survey, it was a behavioral health survey, actually forgotten the topic of the survey, but it was a military research, military troops, anonymous, repeated time point survey, so some similarities. And you, again, you could check yes, consent for research or no consent. And again, everybody was offered the survey and then you could say, yeah, I'm filling this all out, don't use the data, right? So we had this question, which is what do you do when somebody checks a box, yes, at time point 1, at time point 2, they don't check any box, no box. And then time point 3, they do something else. It's like you're trying to read tea leaves here, and again, these are also minimal risk surveys and they're anonymous. So the point of, you want to respect people's preferences, you want them to be able to decide things, but, how meaningful is it that, we're going to now throw away data from time point 2 because they didn't check the box, even though they checked the box at time point 1. We get into these kind of splitting hairs questions about what does this mean, which is kind of bringing me back to this idea of, I don't think this is the most meaningful way to engage with people about research. Could we engage with the soldiers about these surveys in some way to figure out why they're hesitant, or, what are their concerns about confidentiality, or could we teach people a little bit more about what survey research is, or, what this whole program is, rather than these check the box things where people check or don't check and we just have no idea what they're really thinking.
How extensive was there an explanation of what use your data means?
Well, I have to go back. That's a great question. I didn't have time to go back to the original protocol because I can get to it, but I just didn't have enough time. I want to go back and see what the information sheet said. There would have been an information sheet given to the soldiers at the time that says we're going to use the data and it's anonymous and blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Yeah.
And
but
do they read it? Because I would think the default these days is to say, no, you can't use my data.
Well, right, and
but because you hear so much about misuse of data and you never hear about the good use of data.
I think that's exactly the point. How many times do people in everyday life hear a message that says, thank gosh those researchers did that study that proved that when I do this thing it's unsafe, so I'm not doing it anymore. We don't hear and we don't communicate about how research helps people. I'm sorry.
What year was this?
Oh, recently.
2017.
Yeah, so
17.
2019. So actually, one interesting thing is they finished the study right as COVID began. So that was another goal.
I don't understand why they had even do these surveys if they're just collecting data on the percent of suicide. I mean, was the data the percent of suicide ideation in these surveys? That was the outcome measure?
Yeah, the suicidal thinking, ideation, and attempts. But see, they don't.
Oh, that was the outcome.
That was the outcome.
Okay, so not whether or not there were attempts. Well, attempts, but that was separate from this survey.
No, attempts were in the survey. But see, not all of that would have been captured.
Yeah, so, I mean, my opinion, the 20 and 30% really hurts the validity of this study.
Yeah, well,
So the question you're asking is, if there's an actual benefit to finding this out, is non-consent better? Is making it you're required, it's program evaluation, is that serving the population better, right, than the research itself? Because the research, now, there's no validity to the results. Because 30% is a lot, and you don't know why they're not doing it. So, to me, that's a very interesting question. So if you take away the autonomy, are you increasing the benefit to the population as a whole, and even to some of those people, the 20-30%, whose autonomy you're taking away?
Well, right. I think that's exactly the way I would think about
Yeah.
it. Is how much is it worth to give people that choice to say no?
No, as also I left out. I'm a veteran. I served in the infantry for a while, and I'm thinking of this. one of the questions, I think, number one, politically, without delving into that, there's just the conspiracy that the government's collecting all this data about us, right? Which you can't get away from. And I think there's probably a disproportionate representation of that belief in the military setting. But also, what was the physical site of administration of this?
Well, these are the researchers from our group go out with, I think in this case, paper. I think it's
Right.
paper surveys, and you go out and you go in a room with people and distribute.
Yeah, because a thought is like this thought of like, I'm not using the right term, but like malicious re-identification, where, okay, it's anonymous, but I'm taking it with my squad members. Like, the military is so stratified that it is not, they can now, just by knowing when and where this was given, you can narrow it down to at
Right.
least the platoon, which is like 1 in 30, right? So this thought that no matter what they say, if they care to know when and where it was given, I'm 1 of 30.
Right.
So, and dang it, if they want to find out, they can. And then that leads me to wonder, again, I'm sorry, I'm like totally a rookie at this, but like opt-out consent. Like, there's a difference between most consent is opt-in. Like, we will use this unless you check. Like, hey, we're going to use this for a lot of neat stuff, but if you insist on checking no, then go ahead and check no.
Well, that's what we ended up recommending for the other case that I mentioned, where we had the consultation about what to do when it's time 1, time 2, time 3, and there's
Right.
different answers. Is we said one thing you could consider is an opt-out, because then if people are just, forgetful and don't, whatever, they don't check anything, then we're going to assume that's a yes. That's one that helps with people who are just not good at completing forms. But yeah, so I think I do think this fear of identification must be in there somewhere. But this is me guessing. I mean,
But there is, if they're identified, there's true potential harm to them. But, that's an interesting thing. They could be helped, but they could be kicked out of the military, right?
Exactly
So,
right.
so
Right.
this is a study that's great. If in fact it wasn't anonymous, it would be a greater than minimal risk study, right? But the fact that it's anonymous, but they're given the ability to decline their use of their data takes away the validity of the study. So it's a great dilemma that you're talking about. I mean, the question is, if it's so important to find this out, and if they really think this kind of a tool is so effective in reducing mental health, then it does seem that consent is antithetical to the goal.
It does, recognizing, that this would be there'd be some paternalism there, which is the person with suicidal ideation might say, I don't want you to find out that I have suicidal ideation, but we would say, you don't want us to find out because you might get kicked out of the military, but we would rather have you kicked out of the military and be alive.
Right, but
but
it's
so that's
still
what-
an anonymous
What you're
survey.
studying is whether the protocol implementers were actually somehow trained properly and effectively to create enough change, right? Because really, you had the one group that had the trained leaders and the group that didn't.
Right.
And so this is the big argument the CDC always made about program evaluation versus science versus research. This is not to create original data to be replicated elsewhere. This is an internal program. They say this about public health.
Right.
Public
It's
health
about
programs.
the population is the patient.
Is the
they
patient,
say.
right.
Yeah.
And intervention, really, what you're studying is the people administering these things. And so in some ways, there was a loss of all of it in this scenario, which is really too bad, because we both lose critical data that might actually inform them about how high the proportion of suicide risk is currently. That's the study that they're trying to look at. But really, you're just trying to look at, does this new toolkit, if used properly? I would have studied how it's been used by the leaders.
You mean like fidelity of implementation?
Fidelity of
exactly.
implementation.
Well, that is one of their secondary papers.
I
So
just
didn't
don't
present all, but
understand
they did ask that.
Yeah.
Why did they have the right to decline? I just don't.
Because I called it research. That's why.
So it
Your
has to be
fault.
consent.
Your fault.
I'm telling you, and I remember sitting there and I've been in the job like 2 months. I remember sitting there in the library at work and it's like 7 p.m.
But
and
wait
I'm
a
like,
minute, it's minimal
like,
risk
well,
research. It could have, informed consent can be waived with minimal risk
I know.
research. So
Okay.
even though it's research, the consent could have been waived.
I know, but here's the problem, and this is where we get into the regulatory thing, is our IRB office and IRB is extremely conservative about this kind of stuff. And so it's really hard to get them to call something either exempt or, waive consent or all those kind of things. So anyway, I'm just saying, like our researchers, I've never seen any of them ask for a waiver of consent because they've been so severely trained that you could never have that ever. So I totally agree with you, Celia, but I was, as I wrestled with this question,
Yeah,
is it
it's
research
great.
or not, I was like, I
Great
wanted to
case.
say program evaluation, but I didn't have any framework or guideline that told me I could call it program evaluation, because to Faith's point, it was a brand new program that they were just developing. And if you look at OHRP, they have some letter of determination somewhere that says, well, we don't really know when it's research or not, but if it's new, it's
Decades,
right.
still
Decades.
discussions going on. Decades of debate.
I know.
It's confusing because a lot of the SAMHSA grants, sometimes they look at that as being program evaluation,
Absolutely,
and I
they do
remember
that.
working on them,
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm so confused, like the whole time writing this, I'm like, this feels like research, but it's not. But I guess the question here, Liza, I was wondering, when people are, if someone like proposes a study, a similar study, could you have, why are you declining for that question? Like if someone says they want to decline, so would it be okay to add some questions, declining, concerned about privacy, concerned about concerns, and just still give people the option not to answer, but
That's a
maybe that
really
could provide.
interesting idea.
You might get an 80% declination.
Yeah, they would really refuse to answer
Because
Because I'm really
Like,
with
we are,
them.
like, wait a minute, what
Because I don't
about
want to
this?
get
What
kicked
about
out of
this?
the army.
Yeah,
Because I
right.
don't trust any of you.
Well, it's interesting. So another angle, because I know we've all been talking about potential participant perspectives or actual participant perspectives. And so, so we have this new community engagement project program that I started working on at RARE. It's not dealing with this population, the military population, it's dealing with our civilian population that participates in clinical trials. But I went to some of our survey researchers and said, hey, we should have a military community advisory board and get, soldiers on the community advisory board and talk to them about research and blah, 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 blah. And they said, survey people said, oh, no, we got all that covered. We do all that. Because they talked to 220 leaders, but they didn't talk to the soldiers about what it's like to fill out the surveys. And so I'm still hoping, because I do think there's all of the ideas, I agree with your idea, Faith, but all the other kinds of ways we can engage and find out what are people actually thinking about research.
Yeah. Well, and it might have been a good idea to have the community advisory board made up of the people that respond to this, right? It was made up of the leaders, so, right.
No, then they didn't
Yeah.
have a cab. They
Right.
had the focus groups interviews with all the leaders. The leaders it makes sense. They're the end users of the tool.
Right.
So yeah, that was good. I'm not denigrating that, but I still would have
survey,
gone
you
to
want
the
to have the survey
Yeah,
participants
exactly.
tell you.
Yeah.
participants.
And to Lloyd's point, they may have a very different
Absolutely.
understanding of what it means to say, can we use your data? Because maybe that would mean you were gonna actually make me
Right.
say my name. If
Yeah.
I said yes, that might have prompted.
Who knows what they were thinking?
I would just imagine if you were and I don't have this any direct experience, but if I'm in the military and I'm a soldier and I'm asked to even participate in a focus group, what is my incentive to be honest? Like it seems like all of the incentives, like what benefit can I get where a focus group might be perceived as bucking the system in some way, right? The leaders are one thing because they're going to administer the tools and they have some input into how they're going to administer the tool. But if you're asking soldiers to talk about mental health issues when there's such potential consequences, and even if you mandate them to take the survey and it's anonymous, we always wonder, whether people tell the truth or not. We kind of got to the point where we say if we ask sensitive questions, people are generally honest. But in that context, if you force somebody to answer a question, it feels like the incentives are all pushing in the wrong direction, and I don't know how to change that, but.
Well, I think, Sue, your point was that there's gonna be data happening naturally, right? How many, did we have attempts, did we not have attempts, did we have actual suicides? You could have not surveyed anybody other than knowing who was being treated by the experimental leaders that got the training and who wasn't, and just look at the natural
Well, you
stuff,
could, but
right?
I think part of the problem is that the actual, so both attempts and actual suicides are rarer than suicidal thinking. And so
Right,
you're
but-
trying to get to the people with, because, you know, you're partly, first you're trying to get to the people before they commit suicide, but also you're trying to get to the people who you don't know they have suicidal thinking.
Right.
It's not reported, it's not in your data.
But that's not the purpose of that survey. That wasn't the purpose.
Yeah,
of
no,
that.
it was,
No, it
it
had
was part of it,
ideation,
yes.
intent.
Oh, okay.
Suicidal ideation was one of the, see, the endpoints,
But I mean, if you wanted to study suicidal ideation in the military, I wouldn't do it through trying to test this program. You know what I'm saying? Like, it would be sort of a different question.
One of the
Well,
questions,
one
how
of
many
them.
people
It was
were
one of them.
referred? I mean,
Yeah.
how many people were referred by leaders
Right,
to
that's what I'm
treatment?
saying.
That's the program evaluation, in
Right.
addition to whether or not the suicide attempts themselves were reduced. So, you know, there's much better ways to test the tool, the tool itself than, you know, these kinds of
well,
responses,
yeah,
I think.
Rima, can you go back,
But we're gonna have to end
We have to
at
end, but just-
some point.
yeah. So just so that, here's this is the results they reported.
Yeah, but this, the
Total ideation plans and attempts,
decrease.
T3 versus T1, that was the primary results they reported. I'm just
Baseline
to
to-
want to make sure you have.
For
the
these
right
same
data.
people, it was longitudinal?
Yeah.
So from these same people, they said over a, how much?
1 year period.
1 year
One-
period.
Yeah, it was.
Their
right.
suicide ideation decreased.
Can I raise one sort of provocative question? I know we're ending, but this feels like it ties into Sean's case study too, and your comment, Cynthia, which is that there are various ways to answer these questions, but depending on the urgency, public health urgency, individual risk urgency, different types of studies have different advantages and disadvantages. And it feels like the whole thing comes back to this is one giant trolley problem, right? Like you could do what Cynthia said and implement this intervention widely, take the very low frequency behavior of suicide attempts that you recognize and use that as an outcome measure, but it'll take a longer time and people will die while you do it. You can do delayed trials of ART and take a longer time, and it's a question of which population are you putting at risk. But
Well, yeah,
And they could have been lying. See, that's what I don't
Right.
understand. They could lie on the survey time 1, they could lie on the survey time 2. So, you know, again, it's the, how many people were referred? How many people, you know what I mean? That's much better, if one is interested in the actual actions of these leaders themselves, then we want to be studying the actions of the leaders. So it might, I'm concerned that the next phase is just going to be 20,000, 60, I don't know how many people is going to be studied on this thing, and you're going to get the same results, that the way people are responding looks like their ideation has been reduced. We don't have 30% who are even giving us information, but we really don't know how the leaders are acting. There's no
no, but
formative.
they have, to be fair, there's other papers where they did exactly that. They looked at the fidelity to the R4 program, and it was more, instead of like intent to treat, it was more as treated, like when the leaders used the R4 tool, what were the outcomes?
Right.
They have another paper on that. So I didn't present all of
I
it.
see.
So
Okay, great.
just to be fair to the research team, there's more to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is a great, I mean,
Yeah.
it's a great dilemma. I mean, you're raising, and this resistance of IRBs to waive informed consent is a big problem. It's been a problem with adolescent risk behavior forever, especially for, sexual and gender minority youth.
Oh, and that parental permission.
The parental permission, which they don't waive.
Yeah.
So this notion of failing to use what's already in the regulations that permits a certain degree of permissibility and flexibility, but IRBs are worried. They, like you were saying, they're very strict.
Well, and also, and here's the thing, trying to come back a little bit to my beginning about informed consent, is, you know, our IRB members, IRBs, and a lot of us, you know, when we get training in research ethics, get this idea of the sort of the primacy of informed consent drilled into us, you know, that you could never do anything without consent. And so the idea that it might be more ethical to do something with people's data without their consent than to ask their consent is a little bit, you know, heretical. And, you know, and so, anyway, so I think but it's part of the reason, though, I think when we get, you know, several people mentioned city training, and we worked on city training, and we all take that training, and we all get these things kind of, you know, kind of inculcated, which is good. They're good principles, but they're not all the principles. There's more principles.
Right, exactly.
I sure wish that the marketing people would ask permission to use my
Yeah,
data.
I was gonna say, no, they're worried about the government. How about Google? Google knows everything about us.
If you're worried about the police.
I would just say, like a broad comment, so I spent 20 years in social behavioral and then moved into a biomed. And it's just fascinating to see because the social behavioral boards are so conservative and they're so afraid. And yet, when I, like in the context I'm in now, like it's just entirely different. And so like my frame of reference has totally shifted over the past few years. And I'm really, I really want to find a way forward with social behavioral boards to make them understand, you know, you're inhibiting good research, and people are having to make these compromises, you know, design changes in order to get a study through.
People
and
don't
that's so
study
wrong.
anybody under 18.
It's ridiculous. It's
Right.
really wrong.
And this is what happened with the prisoner IOM, is that all the prisoners like, we don't want to be excluded from behavioral research. Yeah, we don't want that other stuff where we were going to get mistreated.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
But that shouldn't exclude all research.
Exactly.
And and then other people argued whether or not volunteers, because they're in prison, and they refuted that.
Yes.
They're like, if I want to do behavioral study, I should be.
But the recommendations ultimately didn't support that, did they?
Oh, yeah, we did
You
support
did
that.
support that, okay.
I mean, there was a lot of controversy around that.
Yeah.
A lot of people felt that there was no volunteerism.
This is Sean.
Yeah.
Just to add to Cynthia point, I think that that's a great point because what we've done is we've been so worried about vulnerable populations that we now tend to exclude them from research, and thus they actually don't benefit because we're so worried about potential risks and harms.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay.
Okay.
Well,
All right, good, yay, Liza, that was